right. So where are we now? If you look in Moodle, and I still don't really know how this works, but if you look in Moodle, there's supposed to be a slot where you can look at your grades. I filled in just about all the midterms yesterday, and there's still one or two people where there's a problem because they may have sent me the wrong document. But basically, everyone should have their results in there. If you weren't informed by email, you can just go take a look. They should all be in there right now. And so that's done. And then we also need to look at, or actually go back and finish up chapter 10 before we go on any further. But before we do even that, on top of everything else, I did add some problem sets. Let's go look at Moodle right now and check this out. All right, let's get this out of here. So yes, down here at the bottom, there's 4 problem sets, 5, 6, 7, and 8. There's going to be one for 9 as well as a sample midterm number 2. I was looking at our schedule, and I think the best way to break up our midterms is to have the second one based on chapters 5 through 9. So in order to get ready for it, we'll start out by doing on Thursday these 4 problem sets, 5 through 8. And then the following week, we'll do chapter 9 problem set and the sample midterm number 2. And then we'll be ready to actually do the second midterm. All right. And then, of course, the final will come sometime in mid-May. And that will just be the last few chapters that we cover. It will not be comprehensive. All right. So the final exam will just be the last, I think, 3, maybe 4 chapters that we'll be covering. So that's kind of relief, I guess, for everyone. But in the meantime, why don't we focus on getting ready for the second midterm, which is chapters 5 through 9. The first 4 are ready here. I'll have chapter 9 problem set ready in the next day or so. And but we'll save that for next week anyway. So we'll do these 4 on Thursday, and then the chapter 9 problem set plus the sample midterm next Monday, and then we'll be ready to roll. All right. In the meantime, we're going to finish up chapter 10 today, and then we can move into 11. Now, in 11, we're getting into some very interesting territory because we're going to be looking at the Federal Reserve System, which is the central bank of the United States, and we're going to be focusing our attention on money. Money, yes, everybody loves money. And so, but this topic itself is more than just about how much money is in your pocket or what you can buy with it. We're going to be looking at a brief history of U.S. currency. And we're also going to be looking at the role that money plays in the economy and how the Federal Reserve can affect interest rates through its control of the money supply. So that will all be a very interesting topic that will take us through chapters 11 and 12. And so that's where we're heading in the immediate future. In the meantime, so like I said, for today, what we're going to do is dive back into chapter 10, specifically chapter 10, part 2, where we had already briefly started to introduce this loanable funds market. So the loanable funds market is the market in which all the individual financial markets are combined. And what we're trying to do is show where funds that are being lent are and funds that are being borrowed will combine with each other to provide us with the equilibrium rate of interest in the economy. So we're making the case here that ultimately interest rates come from the interaction between borrowers and lenders. And of course, one of the things that we have to be aware of is that, you know, it's fine for banks to lend out money, but in order for them to do that, there have to be funds available to the banks. And those funds ultimately come from the savings of individuals. So if we don't save, there's not going to be any lending in the market, and a lot of economic activity will disappear as a result. So yeah, in the United States, the savings rate is pretty low. Fortunately, it's not so low that we don't have enough money to lend out, but it's pretty low compared to many other countries in the world. In fact, just out of curiosity, maybe we can find a table here that tells us What kind of savings rate? Oh, here we go. Now look at some of these countries. Ireland, 56.3. Singapore, Luxembourg. Let's see where the US stands. I bet we're at the bottom. There's China. And where are we? There's Denmark and Germany and Iceland and New Zealand and Australia. There's Japan. Spain, Mexico, Peru. Yeah. Where's the United States? Come on, where is it? We may not even be in the top 100. There it is. We're right there, exactly at number 100. We are the 100th largest savings rate in the world. Oh, but England is even further behind us. That surprises me a little bit. But the bottom line is, this is where all loanable funds ultimately come from the savings of individuals. Now, having said that, 16.9% applied to the US economy is still a very large number. But the rate itself, as you can see, is relatively low compared to all these other countries. So Americans like to spend. That's just the bottom line. But yes, we do need savings to finance all the investment activity that takes place in the economy. Now, fortunately, though, as it turns out, if we don't have enough funds domestically to finance all the investment that is being undertaken, we can actually borrow from foreign countries. Okay, that's always on the table. In fact, we do quite a bit of that. A lot of our investments are, in fact, financed by foreign investments. So, in theory, we don't really need to have enough domestic savings to finance our investments. But if we don't, most likely the interest rates that we'll have to pay will be higher than they otherwise would have been. Okay, so, but the bottom line is savings is where all our funds come from that can be then lent out to businesses and to the government. All right, well, anyway, now, where were we? So yes, this is the loanable funds market. And so we will have, like with any other market we've ever analyzed, we'll have a supply curve and a demand curve. So the loans that are being made are typically being used for business investment, deficits by the government, international investing or lending, that type of thing. And they come from three potential sources: private saving, as we just looked at, any government that has a budget surplus. I don't know if there actually are any out there, but not ours, that's for sure. If the government does somehow manage to run up a budget surplus, that could be construed as a form of savings. And of course, right here, one of our major sources of funds is coming now in this day and age from international borrowing. Now, corporations can use their own internal savings if they choose to do so to finance any of their activities. So they're often referred to as retained earnings. When a corporation has earnings that they do not spend or pay out as dividends, they're referred to as retained earnings. Some corporations have a lot of retained earnings, like Apple apparently has a ton of retained earnings they could theoretically use to finance their operations. And that way they could avoid the need to issue more stocks and bonds. But their policy seems to be to hang on to these earnings because I guess they figure they never know when they might need them. So the company's own retained earnings can be used to finance, let's, for example, if they decide to develop a new product or if they decide to open up a new branch or that type of thing, they could in principle use their own retained earnings to finance those types of activities, but often they choose not to do that. Instead, they turn to the markets and they issue stocks and bonds. That's the decision that's made by each individual corporation. It's kind of like an individual. Imagine yourself wanting to buy a car that's worth $25,000. Suppose you have $25,000 in the bank. You may still decide to get a car loan to pay for the car in spite of the fact that you have the money. Why? Because there might be other things that you want to do with that $25,000. And so by borrowing the money from a bank, you can finance your car and yet still keep your $25,000 to use for other purposes. That depends on what else you could do with that money and how much interest you have to pay to the bank. So corporations think about this in the same way. We could use our own internal savings or we could borrow money from the public. Which should we do? That depends on what other uses we might put these savings to, and how much do we have to pay to raise funds from the public. Anyway, so, and of course, governments, their primary purpose for borrowing is to cover their deficits, which typically are very large. Anyway, so the demand for loanable funds is assumed to come from people who need to borrow money, like businesses invest, and governments need to borrow to cover their deficits. And of course, individuals also borrow money to buy big ticket items like houses and cars and that type of thing. Now, obviously, the demand for these loanable funds will depend on two major factors. How much does it cost to borrow? And for businesses, at least, what kind of profits can we expect to earn if we do borrow this money to finance our activities, like, again, developing new products or creating new brands or whatever the case may be? If those activities are expected to be extremely profitable, then businesses will borrow more money. The real rate of interest, of course, is important because that determines how much it actually costs to borrow this money. And one more thing, don't forget, real here means adjusted for inflation. The nominal rate isn't the big deal. It's not as important as real, because if the real rate of interest is very high, that means the amount of purchasing power that you have to sacrifice to borrow money is very costly, and you may think twice about it, as opposed to cases where the real rate is very low. And so therefore you don't have to sacrifice a lot of consumption or purchasing power in order to borrow money. And then you're probably going to go out and possibly invest in projects, or as a consumer, you might want to use that opportunity to buy a house, a house or a car. Now, having said all that, governments are not affected by either of these two considerations. If they don't have enough money to pay their bills, they have to borrow money. They have to pay for everything they buy too, just like everybody else. So regardless of what the real rate of interest is and what profits are out there, they are going to borrow enough to cover their deficits. That's the bottom line. Okay, now, so the real rate of interest, we did a little detour here and reminded ourselves that the real rate of interest equals the nominal rate minus the inflation rate. Okay, it's really pretty straightforward. Nominal equals the, the real rate equals the nominal or observed rate minus the inflation rate. So the real rate of interest indicates how much a lender's purchasing power will increase as a result of lending money. And it's equivalently represents how much a borrower's purchasing power will decline as a result of borrowing money. So it's always in terms of purchasing power when we're talking about real rates as opposed to nominal rates. Nominal rates just tell us how many dollars we'll pay to borrow or how many dollars we'll earn. The real rate tells us how much our purchasing power will change. All right, so of course, we're going to now define a demand curve for these loanable funds. And you can probably imagine how this is going to be structured, just like any other demand curve you've ever seen in your life, except that instead of a price here, we have the real rate of interest. Okay, that goes in the vertical axis. The quantity of loanable funds is on the horizontal axis. And so the demand curve is downward sloping, which makes sense because what this means is that as the real rate declines, governments, businesses, individuals are going to most likely borrow more money because it's more worth their while to do so. All right. So in other words, if you're trying to decide when to buy that new car you want, most likely you're going to, or you're more likely to buy it if interest rates are very low than very high, because that, of course, determines how much it costs you to borrow the money. As a business, you know, the lower interest rates are, the more likely you are to borrow to finance investments. And of course, like I said before, the government is sort of like, it doesn't care what the real rate of interest is. It's going to borrow what it needs to cover its deficits. So the net effect here is that we have a downward sloping demand curve. And just like what we saw earlier, If we move up and down the same curve due to a change in the real rate of interest, we call that a change in the quantity demanded of loanable funds. But as we'll see in a few minutes, the entire curve can shift if anything other the real rate will change. Okay, so in that case, the entire curve has to shift. So once again, if the real rate changes, we'll just simply move up and down the same demand curve, and we'll have what's called a change in the quantity demanded of loanable funds. Now, what factors could shift this curve, by the way? Well, let's see. What else is there? Well, in this book, they're assuming that profits are really the only other outside factor that might shift and cause this curve to move around. Kind of, and sort of the way to think about it is that profits themselves are important to businesses, but they also reflect the state of the economy. So if profits are expected to rise in the future, that probably means that the economy is doing very well. And then just in general, people will want to borrow more money. All right. In other words, when you borrow money to buy an expensive item, you're certainly not going to do that during a recession because you're always worried that your job might disappear. So the stronger the economy is, the more optimistic you are, the more likely you are to want to borrow funds to buy some expensive purchase. So the profits themselves are not the only reason why the demand changes, but they are an indication of what's going on in the economy. So for example, let's look at this graph. What if expected profits go up? Everybody's happy, everybody's optimistic. The demand for loanable funds will go up. It's just that simple. And let me add one more thing here. To distinguish this from the change in quantity demanded, this could be thought of as the change in demand for loanable funds. Okay, so remember we made a distinction earlier. The difference between the change in quantity demanded and change in demand is that the change in quantity demanded occurs when we move up and down the same curve. A change in demand means the entire curve is shifting due to some outside factor besides whatever's on the vertical axis. All right, great. So higher expected profits shifts the demand curve to the right. Lower expected profits will, of course, do the opposite. That will shift this curve to the left. Beautiful. All right. Now, what about the supply? The supply, again, is coming from savers. They could be domestic savers, they could be foreign savers, and in extremely rare cases, it could be a government that has a surplus, a budget surplus. How does that work? Now, first of all, what is the shape of the supply curve? Well, it'll be just what you expect. In other words, let's jump ahead here a little. Because we're more likely to save when the real rate is very high, the supply curve will be upward sloping. Okay, so imagine as an individual, you have to make a decision between saving your money and spending it. If you're only getting 2% on your savings account, well, you might think, what the heck, I'm only giving up 2% to buy something. Why don't I just buy what I want? Or why don't I borrow what I want? Oh, no, well, sorry, borrowing comes from the other side. But if I have money that I could either spend or save, when rates are really low, the opportunity cost of borrowing is not very high. In other words, I'm not giving up a lot of interest. But if rates go up, let's say I could earn 20% of my checking account, then I think you'll see a very big change in people's behavior. If you could earn that kind of interest, you probably would try to avoid spending every penny you could and keep it in your checking account to earn that astronomical real rate of interest. So ultimately, this quantity that we are willing to save and supply to the marketplace comes right down to what is the real rate of interest. The higher it is, the more we're willing to save, and therefore the quantity of loanable funds will go up. Now, just like with the demand curve, if we move up and down this curve due to a change in the real rate, that is referred to as a change in the quantity supplied of loanable funds. And so, in other words, changes in the real rate are causing us to move up and down this curve. All right, so that's a change in quantity supplied. What about the change in supply when some outside factor changes? Well, what kind of factors could affect the supply of loanable funds? It turns out that there's several of them. Unlike with demand, where there was really only the two, here there's other factors that can get involved in determining what is the supply of loanable funds. Oh, there's so many. Now, the real rate, of course, we knew about that, but what about disposable income and wealth and our expectations of future income? And this last one we'll discuss when we get to it. Default risk basically refers to the risk that lenders will not get all their money back. Okay, so what we want to do is analyze each of these separately and determine how they would affect the supply of loanable funds. Very good. Now let's start. Now the real rate of interest, of course, we already know that if that changes, we simply move up and down the same supply curve. All right, so we don't need to deal with that again, but let's look at some of these other cases. Oh, and here it is. All right, well, this is an example where we do move up and down the same supply curve. When the real rate was 5%, let's say that loanable funds made available to the market were worth $100 million. When the real rate went up to 10%, that went up to 200 million, because now it's more worth our while to save money and make loanable funds available to the market. We call this a change in quantity supplied, of course. But what if some outside factor changes? What happens then? Well, disposable income. Now, in economics, the word disposable income is used to represent after-tax income. In other words, all the money that comes in minus all the taxes that go out. The more affluent you are, the more you're going to want to spend, but also the more you can afford to save. That's a key detail. In other words, we saw that in the United States, 16% is our savings rate. So if, let's say, you got a raise of $10,000 a year, then if you're an average American, you'll be saving 16% of that, which means that the loanable funds will go up by $1,600. So this will happen presumably to everybody in the economy. And so the entire supply curve will shift to the right. All right. So in other words, a shift to the right, which means more funds are available at every rate of interest, that would be this case. If we're in a recession, though, disposable income falls, then the opposite would happen. We're not going to be able to save as much because we have to spend our money on necessities. All right, so savings would go down and the supply of loanable funds would go down with it. And these are collectively known as changes in the supply of loanable funds, not the quantity supplied, if you notice, but the supply. All right, the next factor is wealth. Now, we already, somewhere along the way, we made a distinction between income and wealth. Income means so much per year or per month. That's how much money flows into your pocket. Wealth represents how much do you have saved away. So you could have a lot of wealth with a low income or the other way around. But wealth is not measured on a per unit of time basis. It is measured just in dollars. How much do you have salted away? That is your wealth. Okay, so if you have $1 million in the bank, that is defined as a source of your wealth. Now, according to the book, now I'm not sure if I completely agree with this. They're trying to say that if your wealth increases, meaning your lifetime savings, that actually could reduce the amount that we save. Well, I can kind of see, like let's say your wealth goes from 1 million to 2 million. You may decide that that's already a lot of savings right there. Do I really need to continue saving such a large percentage? And so the book says that higher wealth actually leads to people to save less. I don't know. I'm not completely convinced of that, but the book says that higher wealth reduces the supply of loanable funds because people spend more, even more than they did previously. All right, so I think this is a questionable one, but what about expected future income? Now, this one makes sense to me. What if you are about to graduate and you're pretty confident you'll be getting that first big job very soon? That is a time when you're probably going to go out and start buying things that you need, like possibly a new car and that kind of thing, before the income actually materializes. So that means you're going to spend more and save less than you normally do. So when your income is expected to rise in the future, you'll probably respond to that by saving less today and spending more before the income actually materializes. And then in that case, the entire loanable funds curve would indeed shift to the left. All right. So that means the entire curve will shift to the left and there's less funds available in the marketplace. Typically, the impact of that is to raise interest rates. And in fact, you often see that when the economy is booming, interest rates start going up. And this is part of the reason for that, because people will spend more and save less. And that helps drive up interest rates. Now, this next one is interesting. I started to mention this earlier, default risk. The word default means that a borrower does not repay the money that they owe. Well, if you're a lender, that's always a possibility. You have to be worried about that. Unless, let's say, you put your money in the bank. Now, in the United States, if you have money in a bank, the first $250,000 is insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So even if the bank goes bankrupt, which can happen because they're private companies, you'll still get all your money back. But what if you don't put your money in the bank? What if you instead buy a company's bonds? Well, there's a chance that they may not be able to make all the interest payments that they promised you, and that is known as a default. And the same thing with the banks. I mean, if the banks are worried about the state of the economy, they're going to be reluctant to make as many loans as they normally do. And people who come in looking for a car loan, for example, might get turned away when under normal conditions they would have been acceptable. So default risk, which means the chance of loans not being repaid, makes it harder and riskier for us to save and invest. So therefore, the supply of loanable funds would shift to the left in the event that default risk increases. And most of the time that happens when the economy is in recession. But of course, if the opposite is happening, if the likelihood of repayment is growing, then we would expect people to save and lend more money. And the supply curve would shift to the right. So now finally, we get to bring all these curves together and see how they really work. We're going to define equilibrium in the loanable funds market. Just like any other market you've ever seen, we're going to bring together the supply and demand curves and see how they determine jointly the equilibrium rate of interest in the economy, as well as the quantity of loanable funds. All right, so this is what it looks like. Oh yeah. At the intersection between the supply and demand curve for loanable funds, we have the real rate of interest, the equilibrium real rate, as well as the equilibrium quantity. Now, of course, something can change and shift these curves around. And when that happens, naturally enough, the real rate will change, as will the quantity. So what we're going to do is take a look at some examples of this and see how each one of these impacts the equilibrium rate of interest as well as the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds. Very good. All right, let's see an example here. Oh, by the way, if for some reason the real rate of interest is higher than the equilibrium level, let me share the graph here. What if for some reason R is actually way up here somewhere? That means the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. I'll call this QLF, for quantity of loanable funds, exceeds the quantity demanded. Wait, sorry, I did the wrong thing. QSLF, the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity of demanded of loanable funds. So there's a surplus of funds that nobody wants to borrow because the rate is so high. What would you expect to happen in that case? The banks would see what's going on and they would lower their lending rates. And in the process, as rates started creeping down, people will save less and borrow more. And we'll end up down here somewhere. Okay, now how about the opposite case? The rate is too low. The rate has drifted down to some level that's too low. There's a shortage because people want to borrow a lot of money at such a low rate of interest. The quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. You would expect then that interest rates would creep up. And that's exactly what starts to happen until we're back in equilibrium. When this stops, we'll be in equilibrium. So just like any other market, if the market's out of equilibrium, there's a tendency for it to adjust itself to bring us back into equilibrium. It happens automatically. Okay, the market participants observe all this information and they make changes to ensure that they're making themselves as well off as possible. All right, now in the book, they make a distinction in these loanable funds market between what they're going to call private funds and public funds. So the government is actually, well, the government collects tax revenues, and that is called public money, and they spend the money on various purposes. So in the book, they make a distinction in this framework between the government borrowing and lending and private actors like individuals and firms. So the graph is slightly different when we're considering the behavior of governments. So what do I mean by that? So they're going to show us that, and they're going to claim that altogether, the demand for loanable funds can be broken up into two components: the public demand for loanable funds, which is the demand for the government to cover its deficits, and then the private demand for loanable funds, which is basically businesses, but also consumers. The total demand for those funds comes from, or by combining these two demands. So again, they're making a distinction between the two because the government borrows for different reasons than individuals and corporations. So it's only a small difference. So here's how this affects our graph. Okay. Oh, and the same thing will be true of the supply, but of course the supply only comes from governments when they have a surplus, which, let's face it, very rarely happens. But we can then make a distinction between public supplies of loanable funds and private supplies, so that the total is simply the sum of the two. Now, how does this affect the graph? All right, let's see. Let's say A government budget surplus, I guess it could theoretically happen, leads to an increase in the total supply of loanable funds, which reduces the real rate of interest. How would that look on this graph? So what they're doing here now, this P is public supply of loanable funds. If just this changes, this shift to the right is due to a budget surplus. And because of that, the entire curve shifts to the right. The total supply of loanable funds has increased, not from individuals, not from businesses, but from the government. And the nice effect of that is a lower real rate of interest and a higher quantity of loanable funds. Okay. Now, in the more common case of deficits, what they're doing here is they're essentially saying here that because they're not providing any funds to the market, we can think of this as actually an increase in the demand for loanable funds by the government. Okay, this is the case of the budget deficit. Actually, I have to make a change in the notes here. There we go. It's the demand that's being affected now because they're borrowing. They're borrowing like crazy. Before they were lending, now they're borrowing. So all of a sudden, there's this huge surge in the demand for loanable funds caused by that deficit. And the predictable response is a higher rate of interest but more loanable funds. So this is what people worry about when the government keeps running up deficits, that it'll push up interest rates, which reduces the amount of consumer spending that takes place as well as the amount of investment spending. So if the government doesn't spend the money wisely, we could lose a lot of potentially valuable investment spending in exchange for whatever it is they decide to buy with the money. So if they waste the money, which they do, we're going to lose out on a lot of investment opportunities that could have increased the wealth of the economy. All right. Anyway, so that's it for our discussion about loanable funds. Now, at long last, we're going to introduce Chapter 11, which is our discussion about money. All right, money. It's hard to imagine a more exciting topic. And so in this section, we're going to change or discuss several facets of the monetary system, the role of money in the economy, the functions of the banking system, and we're finally going to introduce the Federal Reserve System and monetary policy. Okay, now we're also going to take a deeper look at money itself, because everybody thinks they know what money is. They think it's just those green pieces of paper in your wallet, but it's a much more complex concept than just green pieces of paper, although certainly those green pieces of paper are a form of money, but there are other assets that could potentially be used as a form of money. In fact, we're going to see that many different types of assets throughout history have been used as a form of money to greater or lesser degrees of success. So we're going to formally define money as anything that satisfies the following functions. Anything that satisfies these could be considered a form of money. That would be the medium of exchange. And we'll explain these as we go along. the store of value, and a unit of account. So what do these things actually mean? Well, let's find out. So first of all, a medium of exchange means it's an asset that people are willing to accept in exchange for goods and services. In other words, if you're a farmer and you're selling crops in the marketplace, there's certain assets that you're willing to accept. In our day and age, you would accept green pieces of paper because they have dollars, numbers written on them that represent money that's backed by the government. Okay, in other words, the government is essentially guaranteeing that these green pieces of paper are a valid form of money. So what does it take to be a medium of exchange? Ideally, it is something that is easily standardized, universally acceptable, and divisible into smaller units. Now, the standardization part simply means that whatever we use for our form of money, all the units are identical to each other. For example, in our case, those dollar bills that we carry around are all the same. I mean, yes, they all have a different serial number, but they're all the same. It's not the case that some of them are bigger than others. It's not the case that some of them have different colors. They're all identical to each other, at least by denomination. In other words, all the $20 bills floating around are the same. And it's easy for people to see that it's a $20 bill. They don't have to check the quality. They don't have to test it in any way. It's a $20 bill. You hand it to somebody, they accept it. End of story. When gold and silver were used as a form of money, this referred to the idea that they could be converted into coins, which again were standardized in the sense that they all looked the same, they all weighed the same, they all had the same quality of gold and silver, and that made it much easier to use them as a form of money. Universally acceptable, this all comes down to confidence. People will not hold a form of money if they don't believe that it will retain its value and that it will always be possible to use it to buy other goods and services. All right, so if there's doubt in your mind, like for example, Bitcoin, perfect example. Does everybody accept Bitcoin? No. Where can you spend Bitcoin? I don't know. Is there any place, does anyone know of any place that accepts Bitcoin?
With Tesla?
Is that right? Tesla will take Bitcoin?
Yeah.
Maybe various like online shops.
Really? Well, I was not aware of that, but PayPal is going to take it. Online gambling? No kidding. But it hasn't quite reached the point yet where it's universally acceptable. I think you'll agree. It's getting there in very small stages, unlike dollar bills, let's say. So I would say that at this point in time, Bitcoin doesn't yet qualify as a medium of exchange because it's not something that everybody is willing to take. When that day arrives, then we'll say, okay, fine, it's a form of money just like all the others. It's too mysterious. It's too weird. I mean, I don't know. One day, maybe we'll see. But anyway, and then now you would think this isn't such a big deal, but the medium of exchange has to be divisible into smaller units in order to make change. Now, this raises a very interesting historical story. In the colonial days of the United States, Britain was extremely angry with us for breaking away from them. And so they refused to allow us to buy gold or silver from them that we needed to make coins. So what did we do? Well, we didn't have enough of our own. So what had to happen was that a lot of foreign coins were circulating in the United States. In particular, the Spanish silver dollar was a very popular choice as a form of money because, of course, it was made out of silver and its value was easily recognized. And everybody was willing to take the Spanish silver dollar as a form of money. Even though technically, it's not an American coin, it's still silver, isn't it? So therefore, a lot of these coins circulated in the United States, And in fact, let me show you what they look like. They're pretty nice looking coins. It's very impressive. This is the seal of the King of Spain. It's very pretty coin. There's just one problem. What do we do about change? We don't have that many coins floating around. So if you bring a Spanish dollar into a store and buy something that's only worth half of a dollar, how do they give you back your change? Well, they hit on this very clever alternative to coins. And here's what they did. Oh my God, what happened here? They took them and they cut them up into as many as 8 equal sized pieces. And that's how you got your change. Each of these individual slices, they look like little pizza slices, was referred to as 1 bit, worth 12.5 cents. 2 bits was equal to a quarter. And because of the way these coins could be carved up into 8 equal pieces, they came to be known as pieces of 8, which you've probably heard of in association with every pirate story you've ever heard in your life. The pirates were always talking about pieces of 8. This is why, because they were talking about Spanish silver dollars that could be broken up into 8 equal pieces. So they came to be known as pieces of 8. So that carried on, surprisingly enough, well into the 19th century. In fact, they stopped being legal tender only in 1857. After that, you had to cash them in somewhere and turn them into American coins or notes. So therefore, while it was hard to turn these Spanish silver dollars into smaller units, it was not impossible. So therefore, the Spanish silver dollars, in spite of being from a foreign country, could be used in the United States as a medium of exchange because they were all standardized. They all had the same amount of silver. Everybody accepted them at their face value. And because at that time, Spain was a very powerful, wealthy country, there would have been no reason for Americans not to handle those Spanish silver dollars. And of course, a lot of them came into the country through Florida, where the Spanish were still located, even after the American Revolution. And so the divisibility part got to be a bit of an issue, but they figured out a way to get around it. How do you like that? They just literally, I guess you'd need a very powerful knife to do this. It's probably an axe that they're using. But yes, so this is what happens when people are desperate. Now, in addition, in order to be a proper medium of exchange, the asset you're dealing with must be easy to carry, and it must be durable. In other words, it cannot spoil. Now, in the early, and again in the colonial days, the tobacco growing states like Maryland and Virginia, at one point in time, people were accepting tobacco leaves as a form of money. But what problem did that represent? Why would that become a problem eventually?
Spoilage.
They spoil. Yeah, tobacco leaves eventually start to spoil. And so that was a real problem. But again, there wasn't enough coinage to go around. And also at that time, paper money was too easy to counterfeit, and that made things very difficult for the colonies. It was way too easy. And in fact, so that's why they had to be careful. And so it was a real problem for quite a few years, as a matter of fact. Now, here's an example that you might find interesting. Here's a form of money that is durable, but not easy to carry. There's a small island in the South Pacific called Yap. It's part of Micronesia, which is a chain of islands north of Australia. In fact, let me show you where Yap is. Okay, it's a little island, but I want you to see where it is in the ocean. That's what Yap looks like. It's a tiny little island and it's one of the Federated States of Micronesia. It's under US protection, although it's not technically a colony or a state or anything like that. But it's 11,000 people live there. It's really tiny. But um, what's interesting about Yap is that the money that they use takes the form of a gigantic stone wheel. Now, it's hard to tell from that picture how big this thing is. So let me find you another one so you can get a sense how big these stones really are. No. Oh, well, actually, there's one. The Smithsonian in Washington actually owns one of these. This one is at the Bank of Canada Currency Museum in Ottawa. That one gives you a better feel, but I wanted to get a picture where there's a person standing next to it to get a better sense of how enormous these stones really are. And you know what? The thing is, they're just sitting on this island. Nobody ever moves them. They just sit there. Well, what kind of system is that? Oh, I didn't realize. It looks like they're promoting themselves and their license plates as the Island of Stone Money. I was not aware of that one. But and there's a picture of them being carted across the river to Yap. And so, but no, I'll find one. Don't worry. See, they're just laying around. Nobody touches them. They're so heavy. And they're just left where they're standing. So how does this work? Well, it turns out what they do is they keep track of who owns each stone. There we go. How big is that thing? That's a big stone. But what they would do is they have records. Everybody keeps records of who owns which stone so that they never have to be moved. And if you buy something with one of your stones, then everybody writes down in their little books the fact that you now are no longer the owner of the stone. And so therefore, there's no need for them to move. Okay. Well, the Bitcoin is more, it's more of an abstract concept. It doesn't need to be physically carried around. But yes, that's a good point. I wasn't thinking about that. How does everybody know which Bitcoin belongs to whom? I don't even know. How does that work? Does anyone want to let us in on that one? Like, what if Bitcoin 321794 is out there in circulation? How do we know who owns it? Oh, a blockchain. Okay. Of course, you realize that I don't know what that means, but okay. So there's a record of it somewhere. I never thought about that. How ironic, from the oldest, most primitive form of money to the most sophisticated, it's still the same idea. So yes, hundreds of these stones are scattered across the island, and every village has a stone money bank. And now some of the stones are smaller than, they're not all gigantic. It's similar to a ledger. I like that. And that way everybody knows that John Smith owns Bitcoin number 21479. And that way nobody else can steal it from him. So it's a tropical island. And yet, this is what really separates from the others. The stones are just hanging around. Nobody would think of stealing them because it doesn't help you, because everybody knows who it belongs to. In fact, there's one stone that somewhere along the way, one of the stones was washed out into the ocean by a storm. And even though nobody can see it down there, they all agree that it is down there. And so that stone still counts as part of their money supply. Just because they all agree that, well, we know it's down there somewhere, so therefore it's still a valid part of the money supply. So anyway, this is what Yap is known for. Now it says here that shell money has been replaced. Oh, I guess They have used shells as well, but it says here that shells, yes, eventually they decided to adopt the US dollar as their transaction, currency of transaction. That's something that you do see sometimes. There are countries scattered throughout the world that actually use the US dollar instead of their own currency. They don't have their own currency, they use dollars instead. And you might ask yourself, how is that possible? But it is possible. In fact, Ecuador uses the dollar. It doesn't have its own currency. Panama, there's a few of them that use dollars instead of their own currency. And so it looks like YAP is going the same way. Wow. All right. Anyway, so there's YAP. It says here, what is there to stop somebody from stealing one? Most matters are common knowledge, and secrets among local people are rare. Thus, the theft of a rye stone or stone money of YAP is relatively unknown. Not that some haven't attempted it. They tried to do that in YAP, and they laughed about it because they all broke. Oh, that's how you get caught, I guess, because the stones break if you try to move them. Huh, interesting. So no matter its location, the Yapese know to whom each stone belongs. And that's all that matters to them. Although they are using dollars too, and at this point in time, this is still the official currency of YAP. Huh. All right, so that's YAP. Now that's, like I said, it's still a form of money, despite the fact that it's not easy to carry. In 1986, YAP adopted the US dollar as its official currency, but the stones themselves are still considered to be the form of money, the main form. The dollars are just for convenience. All right, now how about a store of value? Remember, there's three things that money must do: medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. So what about the store of value? What is that all about? Well, the point of it is that it maintains purchasing power. So like I mentioned earlier with the tobacco leaves, that was not a terribly exciting or useful form of money because it would have spoiled over time. It makes saving possible. Without a store of value, we can't save, okay? And then of course, it also makes, it provides us with what's called liquidity. Now, as far as that goes, liquidity refers to the ease with which an asset can be exchanged for goods and services. A highly liquid asset can be readily exchanged with little or no cost. So I put together a little chart so you can see what this is all about. I've got several assets here and they're listed according to their liquidity. So in the highly liquid column, we have currency, of course, dollar bills and coins, checking deposits, and savings deposits. So, of course, everybody takes money. You can spend cash anywhere you want to go. Checking deposits, most places, even though you don't see it very much anymore, most places will still take a check if you really push it. It's very rare to find a place that will absolutely refuse to take a check, but they do exist. I mean, so currency is more liquid than checking deposits. Savings is a little trickier because in order to spend that money, you have to go to the bank and withdraw the money that you need. So while it's liquid, it's easy to go get your money. You can take it out of an ATM anytime you need it, but it's not quite as convenient as checking deposits, which in turn are not quite as convenient as currency. So while these are all highly liquid assets, this is the most liquid. I would say this is the second and this is the third. Now over here in the liquid, less liquid, stocks and bonds, where these less liquid, it's easy to sell them, but it does take time and you typically do have to pay a fee. That is not the case with currency or checking or savings deposits. These have to be sold. in order for you to spend that money. Now down here we have something interesting, certificate of deposit. Does anyone know what that means?
It's a deposit made for a certain length of time for a guaranteed return.
That's right, exactly. It's basically like a savings account where you have to leave the money there for a fixed length of time. And the advantage of that is that you get a higher rate of interest than you would get with your savings deposits, but you can't get it back before the time is up. So if you put your money in a 5-year CD, as it's called, you've got to leave it there for 5 years. You can't have it back early unless you have a genuine emergency of some kind. So that would definitely make it less liquid than these others where you can sell them anytime you want. It just might take a while. And then look in this category. These are all very valuable assets, but wow, imagine if you had to sell a piece of real estate in a hurry to raise money for debt that you have. It can take a long time to sell real estate, and there's probably a lot of expenses associated with it. What about art? Art has to be appraised, and then you have to find somebody who actually wants to buy it. It could be a very expensive, costly proposition. You could bring it to an auction house like Christie's or Sotheby's, but then they're going to charge you a hefty fee when they do finally sell it. So these are nice assets to have, but they're less liquid than any of the others. And then finally, we have precious stones, diamonds, emeralds, rubies. Same thing, they have to be appraised and they have to be sold, and that could take time. So all of these are valuable assets, but you can see the liquid ones are on the left, the illiquid ones are on the right. Now, if all of that is true, why would anybody ever want to hold illiquid or liquid assets? Why don't people just hold all their wealth in the form of money or checking or savings deposits? What's the big attraction of the illiquid assets?
They don't lose value as fast as currency, like if something happened.
That's right. In other words, if I want to retire eventually, if I put my money in currency, I'm not going to get any rate of return from it. But with stocks, at least there's a chance that I could get a nice rate of return and increase my wealth. And over here too, like real estate can be fabulously profitable. So can these if you know what you're doing. So you're trading off the convenience of liquidity over here against the potential for very high rates of return in these two columns. So there's room for all of them. Most people hold some combination of all of these rather than keeping all their funds in one or the other. All right, so let's jump ahead a little bit here. The last one is the unit of account. That's the third requirement for money, the unit of account. This is simply a way of enabling the values of goods and services to be expressed in terms of a standard measure, which is prices. In other words, money with money, it must be possible to measure its value in terms of a standard unit like prices. So what would happen if we didn't have money? There couldn't be any prices. Instead, we'd have to resort to something called barter. And that barter means we have to trade goods directly for each other. And you can imagine that could get very, very awkward. Okay, imagine yourself. I mean, let's say that now the barter was fairly common in the Middle Ages, but I mean, even then, imagine yourself being a wheat farmer and you need milk. What do? The only way that's going to work is to find a dairy farmer who's willing to trade his milk for your wheat. And even then you have to negotiate the price. So it's going to be awkward, to say the least, compared to having money. So money is one of the best inventions ever of the human race, because this is really what makes commerce possible. All right, now, I want you to bring your attention to this following exciting website where you can learn more about the history of US currency. Although the link is very faint there, this is the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. You can actually go into the museum, I guess, or maybe you could before the COVID, and take a look at all these wonderful notes and coins in their collection. But instead, if you can't go to San Francisco, look what you can do. Now we're getting somewhere. So now you're probably all very familiar with the notes and coins that are in circulation right now. Like here, let me see, just for the fun of it, let's do a poll in which we could prove or disprove this proposition. I'm going to ask you a question about US money. Here we go. Oh no, I'm going to trick you. No, I'm not. I'm testing your knowledge of US currency. All right, here we go. Let's try this. We're going to find out who are experts in US money. Oh, I see a lot of hesitation. People aren't voting. Why not? It's because you don't know. Now, no fair looking on your cell phone, by the way. This is supposed to be your own personal knowledge. Okay, I see the voting is just slowing down. All right, well, I'll tell you what. Oh, some more votes by a very slim majority. Oh no, there's a tie. All right, I guess that's enough of that. So it turns out that the correct answer is in fact Ulysses Grant. And Jackson is on the 20 and Franklin is on the 100. Okay, it only goes up to 100. It used to go up a lot higher than that, which we'll find out later on. But yeah, at the moment, Ulysses Grant, you almost never see $50 bills. You know, when you do see them, and you're not old enough to know this, but you often see them used in casinos, 50s and 100s, which you don't see outside of there. Often, if you win a lot of money, they'll hand you, they're not going to give you a bunch of 20s. They'll probably give you 50s and 100s. Okay, but you have to wait till you're 21 to find this out. But if you do, if you do find yourself lucky enough to win a bunch of money, most likely they'll give you 100s and 50s. Okay, so anyway, so now the U.S. history of money is quite interesting. The U.S. has issued a lot of coins and notes that you're probably not familiar with. And I think just real quickly, what I'd like to do is look at some of them. Now I lost my place here. There it is. All right, so let's take a look, for example, at some notes that were issued. Let's start with silver certificates. Now, what's unique about these notes is that these could be redeemed for silver anytime that the holder wanted. In other words, this is dated 1899. I could have taken this into any bank I wanted and said, listen, I want you to give me $1 worth of silver, and they would have had to give it to you because it says right on there, $1 silver. So these circulated until 1964, when we stopped having silver coins and silver certificates. So all of these are redeemable for silver on demand of the bearer. And you can see there have been a lot. This is a $2 bill, which, by the way, they still make $2 bills. Oh, there's a good question for a poll. Oh my God. All right, hold on 1 minute while I indulge this. I'm having fun with this.
I think I know the answer already.
Okay, well, we'll have to wait a second. All right. All right, we're just about there. All right, I think that's, oh, no, we have a few more votes. Okay. And again, no fair looking at your cell phone. Well, it turns out that once again, the majority of you have it right. It is Thomas Jefferson. And they still have them. I mean, they're still floating around out there. I don't know if they're minting any new ones or not, but if you've never seen one,
I have 200s and $2 bills.
ooh, very good. That's hard to find.
I mean, I work in a store, so someone gets.
Oh,
gave it to me.
that's where you, okay, I get it now. So you, when a $2 bill comes in, you replace it with two singles, and now you've got yourself a $2 bill. Very good. I like that. There you go. Mr. Jefferson is on the $2 bill. And the back of it would be Independence Hall, I think. The signing of the Declaration, maybe. Oh no, I was thinking of something else. There it is, Monticello, his home in Virginia is on the back. And so these are still legal tender. I just don't know if they're still minting any new ones because nobody really uses them. Oh wait, no, I was right the first time. This is the current one. That was an older one. This is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So that's on the back of the $2 bill, the current $2 bill. In fact, if I could zoom in on this one a little more. Oh no, that made it worse. This is minted sometime in the early 2000s. All right. So anyway, let's get back to this. Oh, so yes, the San Francisco Museum. Yes. See, now every time I do this, I keep losing my place. All right, we'll open it up again. So there's all kinds of amazing stuff in here. Now, prior to, there also were gold certificates, which, as you can probably guess, enabled you to trade them in for gold. This one, 1905, it's a $20 gold certificate. Anytime you felt like it, you could bring it to the bank and ask them for $20 worth of gold. No questions asked. Okay, it says right in there, on there, in gold coin. Okay. Wow. There's Hamilton on the $1,000 bill in 1922. But they don't have the most interesting one here. There's, I think that's Madison on the 10 in 1907. But anyway, the largest one they ever minted, let me show you a picture of it because it's not here. They must not own one in their collection. Oh my God, a $100,000 gold certificate issued in 1930. Yes, Noah, go ahead.
Wanted to mention the reason they stopped making these is because of like bank robberies. You could steal much more with much less weight so easily. That's one of the big reasons they stopped making it. Is it was just too easy to steal millions of dollars. It's like you could take 10 of those, it wouldn't even fill up your pocket, and you would have stolen $1 million.
Well, that is true, but they actually stopped doing
It's
this
not the
because-
only reason. It's just one of the reasons.
Okay. Because the U.S.
It
actually
was
went
just
off-
too and also too high risk. It's just really like that. That's just one of the reasons. Also,
Okay.
it's not the main
Right.
reason.
Okay, no, that's true. That's a good point. But
Also, just it was unnecessary.
Well, not even so much that, because remember, in this day and age, we don't have credit cards, we don't have ATMs. I mean, you don't even have checks.
Don't forget, with inflation, 100,000 then is worth like almost 1 million now, if not a
It's
million.
gonna be a lot in that neighborhood. No, but the actual reason this stopped is because we went off the gold standard in 1934. So these were, that was the actual reason. There was no longer a gold standard. So it would have made no sense to allow people to cash them in for gold. But this note, you're right. I can't even imagine how much this would have been worth at that point in time, because this is during the height of the Depression. You probably could have bought several houses with this thing. But it is, in fact, redeemable for gold on demand. It says it right there. I mean, it's $100,000 of gold. And so this is one of the many interesting notes that we've had in American history. This is the largest one ever issued by the United States government. And it never went above 100,000. But now, here's an interesting thing to think about. What do you suppose is the smallest note that they've ever issued? It got as high as 100,000, but what about on the other extreme side? What about the
25
smallest?
cents, I believe.
How much?
Well, 25 cents is the smallest I know of.
All right. Well, let's find out. That's a good guess, but let's find out. During the Civil War, there wasn't, once again, we're running out of gold and silver, and there weren't enough coins, so they started making notes that were worth less than $1. So this one is worth 5 cents. Let's see if I can find the small. Here it is. This is as small as it ever got. 3 cents. This note is worth 3 cents. Now, again, this is during the Civil War when there's no metal available for any kind of coins. So what do? We use paper money that's worth very little. That's as low as they ever got. Okay, 3 cents. That's pretty shocking to think about, a 3-cent note. But 3 cents at that point in time was probably worth about a quarter anyway. So, or probably more than that. But so we've had notes that were very, very small, as well as very, very large. And you can find all of these at this museum and make yourself an expert on the US monetary history if you feel so inclined. And oh boy, where is the it's really amazing how every time I turn around, I need to go back to that link. How does it keep disappearing on us? All right, just a few. I don't want to waste the whole class with this, but I think you'll find this very interesting. What other goodies do we have in here? Oh, I have a very good poll question for you. It turns out that in the entire history of the United States, only once did a woman appear on paper money. So I'm going to ask you in the poll to figure out who that lady was. Okay, so now remember, this is not coins, this is notes. And then I'll show you a picture of it. Okay, note meaning paper money. Okay. All right, I'll throw out some possible candidates up there. All right. Well, we're almost done. Now, I'll give you a hint. Now, I've kind of tricked you a little bit because Susan B. Anthony was on a $1 coin. This woman was the only one to appear on U.S. paper money. And the answer is, dun, 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 it turns out to be Martha Washington. That's right. So let me show you a picture of it. Of that note that she was on. There she is. That's the Martha Washington. It's a silver dollar, silver certificate issued in 1891. And so there it is. How do you like that? Well, now you know. So already you know more probably about paper money than anybody else you're going to see walking around. A lot of people really don't even know who's on the money in their own pockets, much less historical U.S. notes and coins. So anyway, I thought you'd find that interesting. All right, let's see if there's any more fun stuff, and then I guess we'll have to call it a day. But what do we have here? Oh, there's a $10,000 bill. Did you know that we once had a $10,000 bill? This is Salmon Chase, the founder of the Chase Manhattan Bank. I think at the time he was probably the Secretary of the Treasury. Man, $10,000. Doesn't that look nice? There's a Lincoln $5 bill. See, now sometimes in the past, like here he is, Jackson's on the 10 instead of the 20. This is kind of weird to look at. But at that point in time, this is 1914, he was on the 10 instead of the 20. That's McKinley, who's on the $500 bill now, but here he's on the 20. There's our friend. There you go. Ulysses Grant on the $50 bill. That hasn't changed. That's Franklin. Ben Franklin. Not the same picture that's on the current $100 bill, by the way. I'm not sure who that is. I have to do some investigation. Here's Mr. Hamilton. That's Madison. He's on the $5,000 bill. All right. Well, you can see that our money has had, and there's so many more here if you want to take the time to go through these. Also, if you live anywhere near Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Fed has its own Museum of American Money, which you can go visit and see all these wonderful notes and coins. And if that excites you. And so, but they probably have their own online version anyway. Let's just quickly check this out real fast. What's interesting about the Philadelphia Fed, though, which is not true in San Francisco, is that you can visit the Philadelphia Mint, which is basically like a block or two away from the Fed. And what do they do in the Mint? They make the coins. Now, by the way, what's interesting is if you can see it, this is the entrance to the museum. This enormous tube going up into the ceiling. What's in that tube? Well, you can't really see it that well, I'm sorry to say, but that is shredded dollar bills. And it reaches up to the ceiling, and their collective value in there is like billions and billions of dollars of shredded notes are in this tube. Why are they shredded? Why would they do that? Because when dollar bills get worn out, this is what happens. You take it to the bank, they send it back to the Federal Reserve System, and then they shred it up and replace it with a new one. It turns out that dollar bills on average only last about 18 months. They have to be replaced very, very frequently, to say the least. So that's why they're here. And you can buy little souvenir bags of these shredded notes. They're pretty cool. Okay. So anyway, that's the Philadelphia Fed, but it says here they're currently closed. But when it opens up again, you might feel like you should go in there and visit. So anyway, where are we? So anyway, yes. So what we're going to do is jump ahead now, not right this minute, but we're going to jump ahead and start considering something called the money supply. In other words, you might be curious to know how much money there actually is in circulation in the United States. And the answer to that question is it depends on how you define money. There's different ways of defining money. And so there's different measures. And next time we'll go through and we'll see how much of each different type of money there is in circulation. And the numbers are large, as you can imagine, very large. So we'll consider that next. So right now, I guess we'll stop right here. This is now, remember, we're in chapter 11 now. And so what I'd like you to do between now and next time is work on those problem sets 5, 6, 7, and 8. So we can work on those on Thursday, and then we can get back to our fun discussion about money. All right. So how's that sound?
That sounds good.
All right. So see you all next time.
Have a great day.
When is the sample
Thank
midterm,
you.
Professor?
See you later.
When is the sample midterm?
Oh, it's not posted just yet. We're gonna go over it next Monday. All right. It isn't.
Okay,
it's not-
thank you.
So
Bye.
yeah, we're working on it.
Thank you.
All right. See you later. All right. Bye.